My name is Elena. For 25 years, I was the reliable daughter, the one who worked 2 jobs to put herself through college, the one who never asked for a dime, and the one whose savings account was seen by my parents as a collective emergency fund. I was the silent partner in my family's survival, while my brother, Julian, was the star of their indulgence. I lived by a strict ledger of discipline and foresight, only to have my life's work liquidated in a single afternoon to pay off a gambling debt disguised as a business crisis. They told me that family was an investment, where the dividends were paid in sacrifice. I decided to change the terms of the contract. Today, I am the managing partner of Ethelgard Capital, a venture firm that decides which empires rise and which legacy names burn. And today, the people who emptied my bank account are sitting in my waiting room, clutching a deed to a house they no longer own, begging a stranger for a loan they will never be able to repay. The lighting in my parents' living room had always been warm, amber, and deceptive. It was the kind of light that made poverty look like cozy tradition and irresponsibility look like artistic flair. I sat on the edge of the velvet armchair, my hands gripping the leather folder that contained 3 years of my life, $84,000, saved penny by penny from my analyst job at the firm. It was my ticket out, my seed money for a dream they didn't even know I had. "Elena, sweetheart, you have to understand," my father said, leaning forward. His face was a map of practiced grief. He looked like he was about to conduct a funeral, but the only thing dying was my future. Julian made a mistake, a youthful indiscretion. He thought the market was shifting and he took a risk to save the family hardware supply business. "He didn't take a risk on the market, Dad," I said, my voice as cold as a margin call. "He took a risk on a high-stakes poker table in Atlantic City. I saw the credit card statements. I saw the wire transfers to the casino's holding company. He didn't lose the business, he threw it into a slot machine." "Don't be so heartless," my mother snapped, her eyes red from crying, or perhaps from the realization that the lifestyle Julian promised her was evaporating. "He's your brother. He's the one who's going to carry the family name forward. If the business goes under, your father loses his pension and we lose the house. Is your little savings more important than your parents having a roof over their heads?" "It's not a little savings, Mom. It's my life. It's the down payment on the firm I wanted to start. It's the result of 3 years of 80-hour weeks while Julian was finding himself at luxury resorts." "Your family, Elena," his voice dropped into that deep, manipulative bass he used when he wanted something for nothing. "Family isn't a transaction, it's a circle. You sacrifice now, and when you're in trouble, Julian will be there for you. We've already authorized the transfer. We just need your signature to bypass the secondary security on the joint account your mother is still a beneficiary on." "You did what?" I stood up, the room spinning. I had kept my mother on the account from my college days, a sentimental relic of a time when I actually trusted her. "The bank called this morning," Julian said, stepping into the room. He looked pathetic, his designer shirt wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't look like a businessman, he looked like a predator who had run out of prey. "They said the funds are there. We just need the final authorization. If we don't pay the creditors by 5 p.m., they'll put a lien on everything, including your car, Elena, since it's technically registered at this address." I looked at the 3 of them. They weren't a family, they were a syndicate. They had weighed my sweat and my sleep against Julian's addiction, and they decided I was the one who had to pay. "If I sign this," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "I am leaving, not just this house, this life. I will never send you a check. I will never answer a holiday call. I will be dead to this ledger." "You're being dramatic," my mother sighed, waving her hand as if shooing away a fly. "Now sign the paper. The clock is ticking." I picked up the pen. My hand didn't shake. I signed the authorization, watching the ink dry on the death warrant of my first life. I handed it to Julian. He grabbed it with a greedy, shaking hand, not even looking me in the eye. "There," I said, "you have your investment. I hope the house is worth the daughter you just sold." I walked out of the room, up the stairs, and packed a single suitcase. I didn't take the furniture I'd bought, the books I'd collected, or the memories I'd cherished. I took my passport, my laptop, and the cold, hard realization that the only person who would ever invest in Elena was Elena. I drove away from that amber-lit house at 4:30 p.m. By 5 p.m., my bank account was zero. By 6 p.m., I was on a bus heading north, to a city where no one knew my name and no one expected me to sacrifice for a legacy that was nothing more than a hollow shell. I spent the first night in a bus station, my suitcase between my knees. I opened my laptop and looked at the stock market. It was crashing. The world was in chaos. People were losing millions. Perfect, I thought. In a world where everything is falling apart, the only thing that matters is the person who knows how to put the pieces together. I didn't cry, I didn't call, I started a spreadsheet. I listed every contact I'd made in my 3 years as an analyst. I listed every undervalued tech startup I'd researched. I listed my new goal, $100 million. I was no longer a daughter, I was no longer a sister. I was a venture capitalist in the making, and I was going to make sure that the next time my family needed an investment, the price would be so high it would bankrupt their very souls. For the next 5 years, I lived in a studio apartment the size of a closet. I ate ramen, I worked 18-hour days at a boutique hedge fund, and I used every ounce of my rage to fuel my hunger. I learned how to spot a liar from a mile away. Julian had been a great teacher. I learned how to negotiate until the other side was grateful for the crumbs I left them. I climbed the ladder not by being nice or reliable, but by being indispensable and ruthless. I founded Ethelgard Capital in the middle of a recession, buying up the blood in the streets and turning it into gold. And then, one Tuesday morning, my assistant buzzed my desk. "Ms. Thorne, there's a group in the waiting room. They don't have an appointment, but they claim it's a family emergency regarding a property bridge loan. They say they represent Thorne Hardware and Supply. They look a bit desperate." I leaned back in my Italian leather chair, looking out at the skyline of the city I now owned. I checked my digital ledger. The zero I started with was now a number with 9 digits. "Send them in," I said, a slow, predatory smile crossing my face. "Tell them the interest rate just went up." The heavy oak doors of my inner office swung open with a silent, hydraulic grace. My assistant, Sarah, stepped aside, her face a mask of professional neutrality that I had trained into her. Behind her, 3 shadows of my past shuffled in. Julian led the way. He was wearing a suit that was once expensive but now hung limp on his frame, the fabric shiny at the elbows. My father followed, his posture stooped, his eyes darting around the room at the floor-to-ceiling windows and the minimalist art that cost more than their entire hardware inventory. My mother brought up the rear, clutching her handbag as if it were a shield, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and intimidation. They didn't recognize me at first. I was sitting with my back to them, looking out at the skyline. I had changed my hair, my style, and even the way I held my shoulders. I was a monument to self-made armor. "Thank you for seeing us, Miss..." Julian started, his voice a pathetic attempt at a big city business tone. "We were told Ethelgard Capital is the only firm currently looking at high-risk property bridge loans. We represent Thorne Hardware and Supply. We have a legacy of 40 years, and we're looking for a short-term injection of $3 million to bridge a minor liquidity gap." "A minor liquidity gap," I repeated, my voice low and amplified by the acoustics of the room. "Is that what we're calling a third mortgage and a mountain of unpaid vendor invoices these days?" The room went cold. I slowly spun my chair around. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched the recognition hit them like a physical blow. First, my mother, her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with a shock that was almost comical. Then my father, whose face turned a pale, sickly gray. And finally, Julian. He gasped, his knees buckling slightly as he realized whose desk he was standing in front of. "Elena?" My mother whispered, her voice trembling. Is that really you?" "My name is Elena Thorne, managing partner of Ethelgard, and in this room the only family that exists is the one listed on a balance sheet. Sit down, you're wasting my billable hours." They sat down, perched on the edge of the designer chairs as if they expected them to eject them at any moment. "We've been looking for you for years," my father cried, his voice regaining some of that old manipulative authority. "After you left, we were worried sick. We didn't know where you went, what you were doing. And now look at you, my daughter, the big executive. I always knew you had a head for business." "You didn't know I had a head for business," I countered, my eyes locking onto his. "You knew I had a bank account that you could drain. You didn't look for me. You looked for the $84,000 that I wouldn't let you steal a second time. Let's not rewrite history, Silas. It's bad for the audit." "Elena, please," Julian stammered, his eyes red. "Things have been tough. The market, it shifted. Big box stores moved in. We just need this loan to stay afloat. We've put the family house as collateral. It's all we have left. If you just sign the approval, we can save the legacy. We can be a family again." I pulled a file from my drawer. I didn't need to read it. I had memorized their failures months ago. "The legacy is a rotting carcass, Julian," I said, sliding a sheet of paper across the desk. "You didn't lose the money to big box stores. You lost it to a series of crypto investments that were clearly Ponzi schemes, followed by another disastrous weekend in Las Vegas 3 months ago. You've been skimming from the employee pension fund to cover the interest on your private debts. If I were a bank, I wouldn't just deny you, I'd call the authorities." "How do you know all this?" my mother asked, her voice shrill with panic. "Because I bought your debt, Mom," I said, a slow, sharp smile crossing my face. "6 months ago, every penny you owe to the suppliers, every lien against the house, every defaulted credit card, Ethelgard is your primary creditor. You don't owe the bank, you owe me." Julian stood up, his face turning from pale to a desperate, ugly red. "You did this on purpose. You hunted us down. You're supposed to help us. You're my sister. You're blood." "Blood is a liquid asset, Julian, and yours has no market value," I replied, standing up to meet his height. "You told me 5 years ago that family was a sacrifice. You told me that my life's work was a collective emergency fund. Well, this is the emergency, and I've decided that the best investment I can make right now is to let you fail." "You wouldn't," my father whispered, his bravado finally shattered. "You wouldn't take your parents home. You wouldn't put us on the street." "I'm not taking your home, Silas. I'm foreclosing on a toxic asset." I walked around the desk. I stood in front of the people who had once seemed so tall, so powerful in their amber-lit living room. "You have 30 days to vacate. I'll be converting the property into a subsidized housing unit for women who have been financially abused by their families. It seems poetic, don't you think?" "Elena, please," my mother sobbed, reaching for my hand. I stepped back, the movement sharp and final. "We're sorry. We were wrong. We'll do anything. Just don't do this." "You're 5 years too late for an apology, and $3 million too short for a deal. Sarah, show them out, and call my legal team. I want the final eviction notices served by noon."
They were let out, Julian shouting insults that didn't land, my parents weeping with a genuine terror that they had never felt when it was my life on the line. I stood by the window as the doors closed, the silence of the office returning like a cool, refreshing breeze. I looked at my digital ledger. The zero I had started with was long gone, but as I watched them walk toward the elevators on the security monitor, I realized that the greatest dividend I had ever earned wasn't the money, it was the absolute, unyielding power to say no to the people who thought I was born to say yes. The investment in nothing had finally matured, and the payout was everything.
The security system in my penthouse didn't scream. It whispered. A silent notification pulsed on my watch at 2:14 a.m. while I was reading a venture prospectus in my study. Sensor 4, service entrance, unrecognized biometric signature. I didn't call the police. I didn't panic. I simply stood up, adjusted my silk robe, and walked toward the living room, where the city lights bled through the floor-to-ceiling glass like neon ink. I saw him. Julian was crouched by my mahogany sideboard, his hands trembling as he rifled through a leather portfolio I'd left there as bait. He looked like a cornered rat, sweaty, disheveled, and smelling of cheap whiskey and desperation. He thought he was looking for a master deed or a signed waiver. He didn't realize he was looking at a collection of dry cleaning receipts. "The light is better over here, Julian," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. He jumped, knocking over a crystal decanter that shattered against the marble floor. He spun around, clutching a handful of papers to his chest as if they were a shield. "Elena, I just came to talk. The security downstairs, they wouldn't let me up. I had to find another way. We're family, remember? You can't keep me out." "You didn't come to talk, you came to steal," I said, walking toward him with a slow, rhythmic confidence. "You thought you could find something to blackmail me with, or maybe a blank check you could forge. You're still playing the same low-stakes game you played in Atlantic City, Julian, but this isn't a casino. This is my home." "You're destroying us," he roared, dropping the papers. The bravado of the golden boy was gone, replaced by a jagged, ugly fear. "Mom is on sedatives. Dad can't even look at the mail. You have millions, Elena. What is one house to you? What is one business? You're doing this just to hurt us." "I'm doing this because it's a sound fiscal decision," I replied, stopping just a few feet from him. "You embezzled $400,000 from the Thorn Hardware Employee Pension Fund, Julian. I have the forensic audit right here on my tablet. That's a felony. A long, cold, unglamorous felony." Julian's face went from flushed to a sickly, translucent white. You can't prove that." "I don't need to prove it. I've already handed the files over to the district attorney's office. They're just waiting for my signal to hit submit on the formal complaint." I lied. I hadn't sent them yet, but the terror in his eyes told me I'd hit the vein. "So, here is the new deal. The only investment I'm willing to make in you." I pulled a small gray folder from the sideboard. "Option A, you walk out of here, I press submit, and you spend the next 5 to 10 years in a state penitentiary for white-collar theft. The house is seized by the state, and Mom and Dad end up in a homeless shelter because their star son ate their future." Julian swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. "And option B?" "Option B, you sign a total confession of the embezzlement. You sign a lifetime restraining order, legally barring you from ever contacting me again. In exchange, I will move Mom and Dad into a modest 2-bedroom apartment in a quiet suburb. I will pay their rent and medical bills for life, directly to the providers. They will never see a penny of cash, and neither will you." "You're buying them off?" Julian whispered. "I'm stabilizing the asset," I corrected. "But there's a catch. You leave the state tonight. I've bought you a one-way bus ticket to a small town in the Midwest. I've set up a job for you at a warehouse, loading crates, not managing them. If you ever set foot in this city again, or if you ever try to call mom or dad to ask for money, the DA gets the files. You will vanish, Julian. You will become a ghost with a steady paycheck and no legacy." "You'd cast me out like a dog?" he hissed, a flicker of the old resentment returning. "I'm casting you out like a bad debt," I said, sliding the confession and the bus ticket across the marble counter. "You told me 5 years ago that I was family, and therefore I had to sacrifice. Well, tonight, you're the sacrifice. You're the nothing I'm finally liquidating to save what's left of the people who raised me." Julian looked at the papers, then at the shattered glass on the floor, then at me. He saw no mercy in my eyes. He saw only the cold, hard math of a woman who had learned that love was a liability she couldn't afford. He picked up the pen. His signature was a jagged, broken scrawl. "I hate you," he spat as he shoved the bus ticket into his pocket. "I know," I said, opening the service door for him. "But in my world, hate is just another form of interest, and you've finally paid yours in full. Goodbye, Julian. Don't look back. There's nothing left here for you to lose." I watched him go, a shadow disappearing into the service elevator. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel a sting of regret. I simply walked to my kitchen, poured the rest of the ruined whiskey down the drain, and went back to my study. The Thorne name was officially off the books. My portfolio was clean, and as the sun began to rise over the city, I realized that for the first time in 5 years, my internal ledger was perfectly balanced. The new apartment was located in a quiet, gray suburb, 40 minutes away from the pulsing heart of my empire. It was clean, the walls painted a neutral off-white that reminded me of a high-end recovery ward. There was no velvet furniture here, no amber-lit chandeliers, only sturdy Scandinavian designs that I had picked out for their durability and lack of sentimental value. I stood in the small kitchen, checking the digital thermostat. My parents sat at the laminate dining table looking like refugees from a country that had been erased from the map. It's very small, Elena," my mother whispered, her voice trembling as she clutched an old frayed photo album to her chest. "The ceiling in the hallway has a scuff mark, and there's no room for the piano. How can your father live without his music?" "The piano was sold to cover the back taxes on the mansion, Mom," I said, my voice as flat as a balance sheet. "And the smallness is a feature, not a bug. It's easier to maintain on a fixed budget, a budget that I am providing." My father looked at me, his eyes hollow. "Where is Julian? He hasn't answered his phone in 3 days. The neighbors said they saw him leaving the house with a suitcase at midnight. What did you do to your brother?" "I gave him a career change. He's currently learning the value of manual labor in a place where no one knows his name. He won't be calling, Silas, and if he does, and you give him a single cent of the allowance I'm sending to your grocery account, the lease on this apartment is terminated instantly. Do I make myself clear?" "You're a dictator," he spat, though the fire in his voice was dampened by the fear of the street. "You've imprisoned us in this box. I've rescued you from a bankruptcy that would have seen you in a state-run facility. This box is a gift you didn't earn. It's an investment in my own peace of mind, not a reward for your parenting." My mother suddenly stood up and walked toward me, opening the photo album. She pointed to a grainy picture of me at 6 years old, wearing a homemade ballerina tutu, smiling at a camera held by a younger, happier Silas. "Look at this, Elena," she pleaded, her voice thick with forced nostalgia. "Remember this day? Your father worked extra shifts at the hardware store just to buy you those slippers. We loved you. We were a family. How can you look at this little girl and then treat us like line items in a ledger?" I looked at the photo. I remembered the day. I also remembered that the extra shifts my father worked were actually used to pay off a gambling debt he'd hidden from my mother, and the slippers had been bought with a credit card that I eventually had to pay off 10 years later when I started my first job. I see a child who was being groomed for a lifetime of service, I said, my eyes moving from the photo to my mother's face. I see a little girl who didn't know that every gift came with an invisible interest rate that she would be expected to pay back in blood. That girl is gone, Mom. She died the afternoon you emptied her bank account to save a son who never gave you anything but grief. We were desperate, she cried, slamming the album shut. Desperation is a reason, not an excuse, I said, picking up my car keys from the table. You made a bet 5 years ago. You bet that I would always be the reliable one, the one who would take the hit so the family could stay upright. You lost that bet. I'm the house now, and the house always wins. I walked toward the door, but I stopped and looked back at them one last time. They looked so small in the sterile light of the apartment, two people who spent their lives spending other people's futures. The groceries will be delivered every Monday. The utilities are on auto pay. If you need anything medical, call the number on the fridge. It goes directly to my assistant's office. Don't call me. I have an empire to run, and your account is officially closed. I stepped out into the hallway and closed the door. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the most satisfying melody I had heard in years. I walked down the stairs, past the beige walls and the scent of lemon floor wax, and stepped out into the cold, sharp air of the evening. As I drove back toward the city, the skyline glowing like a hoard of diamonds in the distance, I felt a strange sense of weightlessness. The guilt they had tried to anchor me with had finally detached. I wasn't the daughter, the sister, or the martyr anymore. I was Elena Thorne, and for the first time in my life, I was worth exactly what I said I was.
The glass walls of my boardroom usually offered a panoramic view of progress, cranes building the future, lights shimmering like data points. But today, the view was obscured by a thick gray fog rolling in from the harbor, mirroring the murky legal storm brewing on my desk. They're calling themselves the Discarded, my head of PR said, her voice tight with suppressed irritation. She slid a tablet across the polished obsidian table. It's a coordinated social media campaign, Alina. Your brother Julian has surfaced in Chicago. He's gathered a group of distant relatives, former business associates of your father, and even a few disgruntled ex-employees from the hardware store. They're filing a collective suit. I looked at the screen. There was Julian, looking suspiciously well-groomed, standing in front of a grainy photo of our old family home. The headline screamed, "Venture Queen Builds Empire on Family Graves." She continued, "The narrative is simple. You used insider family information to bankrupt your own father, seized their assets through predatory lending, and then exiled your only brother to manual labor to cover your tracks. They're seeking a restorative settlement of $50 million, and they've leaked the story to the Financial Times." I felt a cold, familiar hum in my veins. It wasn't fear, it was the thrill of a market correction. "They aren't looking for a settlement, Sarah," I said, leaning back. "They're looking for a ransom. Julian knows I'm preparing for the initial public offering of our green tech fund. He thinks I'll pay him to be quiet so I don't spook the institutional investors." "Will you?" she asked. "I don't pay for silence. I invest in the truth. It has a much better long-term yield." I spent the next 48 hours in the War Room, a windless office in the basement of my building, where my private investigators and forensic accountants lived. We didn't look at Julian's claims, we looked at his backers.
Found it, my lead investigator said, tapping a key. The lawsuit is being funded by Valiant Equity. It's a rival firm, Elena. They've been trying to short our stock for months. Julian isn't the mastermind. He's the Trojan horse. They promised him a cut of the settlement if he could damage your reputation enough to drop our valuation. I looked at the data. Julian had been living in a luxury hotel paid for by a consulting fee from a shell company linked to Valiant Equity. He hadn't been working in a warehouse. He'd been spending his consulting checks on underground baccarat tables. He broke the agreement, I whispered, a slow smile spreading across my face. The restraining order, the confession, he thought they were just paper. He forgot that in my world, paper is a weapon. I called my parents. It was the first time I'd spoken to them in over a year. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice small and hesitant. Elena, is that you? The news. They're saying such terrible things. Julian called us. He said you're in trouble. He said if we sign a statement saying you coerced us into the apartment, he could get us our house back. He said we'd be rich again. And did you sign it, Mom? I asked, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. Your father wanted to, she whispered. He misses the garden. But I remembered what you said, about the interest, about the blood. I told him no. I told him Julian was just gambling with our lives again. Good, I said. Keep the door locked. I'm sending a car for you. You're going to a secure location for a few days. And Mom, tell Silas that if he speaks to a single reporter, the medical trust is voided. This is the final margin call. I hung up and turned to my legal team. We're not filing a motion to dismiss. We're filing a countersuit for racketeering, extortion, and breach of contract. And I want a private meeting with the CEO of Valiant Equity. Tell him I have the transcripts of his payments to my brother. Tell him he can either withdraw the funding for the suit and issue a public apology, or I will initiate a hostile takeover of his firm by the end of the week. I already have 40% of his board in my pocket. The office went silent. They knew I wasn't bluffing. I had the capital, I had the data, and most importantly, I had the lack of sentimentality that made me untouchable. Julian thought he was playing a game of family justice. He didn't realize he was playing a game of global finance. And in that game, the person who has the most to lose isn't the one who was betrayed. It's the one who doesn't understand the value of the collateral. I stood by the window of the war room, looking at the glowing monitors. The fog was starting to lift. I could see the city again. The investment in nothing was about to yield its most aggressive profit yet, the total and permanent erasure of the Thorn name from the shadows of my life. I wasn't just defending my empire, I was perfecting it. And Julian was about to learn that when you try to short a woman like me, the house doesn't just win, it takes everything you ever hoped to become.
The venue was the grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel, a space defined by gilded columns and the sharp, predatory scent of old money and new scandals. I had organized a family reconciliation gala, a masterstroke of PR that had the media salivating. To the outside world, it looked like the venture queen was finally bowing to the pressure of blood. To Julian and his backers at Valiant Equity, it looked like a white flag. I stood backstage, my reflection in the silver-framed mirror looking back at me with a terrifyingly calm resolve. I wore a dress of liquid charcoal silk, minimal and sharp. No jewelry, except for a watch that tracked time with the precision of a sniper. "He's here," Sarah whispered, leaning into the room. "He's brought a camera crew from a tabloid. He looks like he's already spent the settlement in his head." "Let him," I said, checking my tablet. The live feed was already broadcasting to 3 million viewers. The ticker at the bottom of the screen showed Ethelgard Capital's stock holding steady. "Is the feed from the private suite ready?" "Connected." We have the audio from the Valiant CEO's burner phone synced to the big screen. We just need him to take the bait." I walked onto the stage. The applause was polite, filtered through a thick layer of skepticism. I stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of reporters, investors, and in the very front row, Julian. He sat with his legs crossed, a smug, triumphant smile on his face that turned my stomach. "5 years ago," I began, my voice clear and projecting to the back of the hall, "I left this city with nothing but a suitcase and a hard lesson in the cost of loyalty. Today, I stand before you as the head of a firm built on the principle that the only true investment is the one made in character. My brother, Julian, has recently brought forward a claim that I have neglected my family for the sake of profit." Julian nodded solemnly to the cameras, playing his role of the wronged martyr to perfection. "I invited Julian here tonight to settle this matter publicly. Julian, you've asked for $50 million to compensate for the emotional and financial damages I've caused. You've claimed that I forced our parents into poverty. Is that correct?" Julian stood up, adjusting his lapels. "It is, Elena. It's not about the money. It's about justice. It's about the fact that you turned your back on the people who gave you everything." "Justice," I repeated, the word tasting like copper. "Tell me, Julian, does justice involve the $200,000 you received in consulting fees from my direct competitor, Valiant Equity, over the last 6 months? Does it include the promises they made to you to fund this lawsuit in exchange for a short position on my company's IPO?" The room went deathly silent. Julian's smile faltered, a flicker of panic darting through his eyes. I don't know what you're talking about. Those are lies, defamation." "Are they?" I tapped a button on the podium. The massive screen behind me flickered to life. It wasn't a family photo. It was a recorded video call, the one my investigators had intercepted 24 hours ago. It showed Julian in a hotel suite, leaning over a table with the CEO of Valiant. "Look," Julian's voice boomed through the ballroom speakers. "Elena is cold, but she's not stupid. Once the media starts dragging her for starving her parents, she'll sign anything to make it stop. I want 60% of the settlement, and I want her seat on the Green Tech Fund. Just keep the pressure on the FT reporters." The CEO's voice responded, "Just make sure you look pathetic on camera, Julian. The Dispossessed Brother Act sells. We'll crush her valuation, buy the dip, and you'll be a very rich man." The video cut to black. The ballroom erupted in a cacophony of camera shutters and gasps. Julian looked as if the floor had suddenly turned into liquid. He grabbed the back of his chair, his face a ghostly, translucent white. "That's a deep fake," he screamed, his voice cracking into a shrill, desperate register. "She's using AI to frame me. It's another one of her digital tricks." "It's a forensic recording, Julian, verified by 3 independent cybersecurity firms," I said, stepping away from the podium and walking to the edge of the stage. I looked down at him, not with anger, but with a profound clinical pity. "You didn't come here for family. You came here to sell me out the 3rd time in 10 years. But you made a mistake. You assumed I was still the girl who would stay quiet to protect the Thorn name." I turned to the cameras. "As of this moment, Ethelgard Capital is filing a multi-million-dollar racketeering suit against Valiant Equity and Julian Thorn. The evidence has already been delivered to the SEC and the district attorney. The Thorn name isn't being destroyed by me. It was liquidated long ago by the man standing in front of you." I walked off the stage as the security team moved in to escort Julian out.
He was shouting, crying, a broken man in an expensive suit he hadn't paid for. The camera shutters swarmed him, but they weren't looking for a hero anymore. They were looking for a corpse. I reached the wings of the stage and found my father standing there, leaning on his cane. He had watched the whole thing from the shadows. His face was unreadable, a mixture of shame and the slow, heavy realization that his golden boy was nothing more than a hollow fraud. "He really did it, didn't he?" Silas whispered, his voice trembling. "He never stopped selling you, Silas," I said, not slowing down. "He just ran out of things that were yours to give away. The car is waiting. Go back to the apartment. The groceries will still be there on Monday. But don't ever ask me to be family again. I've already paid that debt in full." I walked out to my waiting car, the flashes of the paparazzi reflecting off the blacked-out windows like silent explosions. I checked my phone. My company's valuation was climbing. The market had seen the truth, and the market had decided that Elena Thorne was the only asset worth holding. The liquidation was complete. Julian was gone, Valiant was in ruins, and the Thorne name was finally, mercifully, dead.
The aftermath of the Pierre Hotel Gala was a clinical, high-speed execution. Valiant equity collapsed within 48 hours as their institutional investors fled the stench of racketeering. Julian was out on bail, his face a constant fixture on the lower third of every financial news cycle, labeled as the scion of deceit. I sat in my office, the silence now so thick it felt structural. I had won every battle on the spreadsheet, but the biological ledger was still open. "He went to the apartment, Elena," Sarah said, stepping into the room without her usual clipboard. Her face was pale. "Our security team at the suburban complex reported that Julian bypassed the perimeter an hour ago. He didn't use force. Your mother let him in." I felt a cold, sharp spark in my chest. Not fear, calculation. I had given them a sanctuary, a clean slate, and a perimeter, and Margaret had opened the gate for the wolf who had already eaten her flock. "Monitor the internal audio," I commanded, standing up and grabbing my coat. "I want to hear every word, and get the car ready. It's time to see if my investment in their security was a total loss." As I drove toward the suburbs, the audio feed from the hidden microphones in the apartment played through my car speakers. It was a symphony of manipulation that I knew by heart. "They're going to send me away, Mom." Julian's voice was ragged, pitched in that high, desperate whine he used when he was 5 and had broken a neighbor's window. "Elena has the DA in her pocket. She won't stop until I'm behind bars. I just need 50,000, just to get across the border, to start over. You have the emergency card she gave you. You have the jewelry she bought you for the anniversary." "Julian, I can't," my mother sobbed. I could hear the clink of teacups, the sound of a woman breaking in half. "She told us, if we help you, we lose everything. The apartment, the doctors, the food. She'll put us on the street." "She's bluffing," Julian roared, and I heard the sound of a chair being kicked back. "She's your daughter. She's cold, but she won't let her own mother starve. She's just trying to scare you. Give me the jewelry, Mom. Give me the Rolex she gave Dad. It's sitting right there in the velvet box. It's my life or your comfort. Choose." I pressed my foot harder on the accelerator. The city blurred into a streak of gray. I heard the sound of a drawer being yanked open. I heard my father's labored breathing, the sound of a man who had long ago surrendered his spine to his son's appetite. "Margaret, don't," Silas whispered. "Elena was right. He'll just lose it again. He'll just sink us deeper." "Shut up, old man," Julian spat. "You're the one who taught me how to play the odds. Now give it to me." I pulled into the complex, the tires screeching against the asphalt. I didn't wait for the security detail. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heart beating with the precise rhythm of a closing bell. I reached the door of 4B and didn't knock. I used my master key. The scene inside was a tableau of historical repetition. My mother was standing by the dining table, her hands trembling as she held the gold Rolex I'd bought Silas to replace the one Julian had pawned years ago. Julian was reaching for it, his eyes bloodshot, his face a mask of predatory greed. "Drop it, Margaret," I said, my voice echoing in the small, sterile room. They all froze. Julian spun around, his hand instinctively going to the small of his back, then dropping when he realized I wasn't alone. 2 of my security guards were right behind me. "Elena!" my mother gasped, the watch slipping from her fingers and hitting the laminate floor with a dull thud. "He's in trouble, Elena. He's your brother. He just needs a chance to get away." "He had 5 years of chances, Mom. He had a bus ticket and a job. He chose a penthouse and a conspiracy instead." I walked into the center of the room. I didn't look at Julian. I looked at the woman who was still willing to bankrupt her old age for a lie. If you give him that watch, or if you give him the PIN to the grocery card, you are choosing him. And if you choose him, you are choosing the street. I told you that 18 months ago. I am a woman of my word. "You wouldn't," Julian sneered, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're too obsessed with your image, Elena. Venture queen evicts own parents. Imagine the headlines tomorrow." "The headlines already say you're a racketeer and a thief, Julian. My reputation is built on making hard choices that yield results. Evicting 2 people who collaborated with a fugitive isn't a scandal. It's a standard operating procedure," I countered. I turned to my mother. "The watch, Mom. Pick it up and put it in my hand, or walk out that door with him right now." The silence in the room was absolute. I watched the gears turning in Margaret's head, the decades of family-first propaganda clashing with the cold, hard comfort of the central heating and the filled refrigerator. She looked at Julian, who was nodding frantically, his eyes begging her to be the martyr one last time. Then she looked at me. She saw the woman who paid for her heart medication. She saw the woman who didn't ask for her love, only for her survival. Slowly, painfully, my mother leaned down. She picked up the gold watch. "I'm sorry, Julian," she whispered, her voice cracking. I can't go back to the darkness. I'm too old to be hungry again." She walked over to me and placed the watch in my hand. It was heavy, warm from her touch, and felt like the final piece of a broken soul. "You bitch!" Julian screamed, lunging toward our mother. My security team intercepted him before he could get within 3 feet. They pinned him against the wall, his face pressed against the neutral off-white paint he had tried to ruin. "Get him out of here," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "Hand him over to the marshals waiting at the perimeter. Tell them the family emergency is over." They dragged him out. He didn't go with dignity. He went with the same shrill, empty threats that had defined his entire life. When the door finally closed, the apartment felt like a tomb. My father sat back down at the table, his head in his hands. My mother stood by the window, watching the police lights flash in the parking lot below. "You've broken us, Elena," she said, her back to me. "You've finally broken the circle." The circle was a noose, Mom. I didn't break it. I just cut the rope before it finished the job. You'll have your groceries on Monday. You'll have your quiet. But don't ever think that Julian was the one who loved you. He was the one who ate you. I'm the one who kept you whole. I walked out of the apartment without looking back. As I drove back toward the city, the skyline was blindingly bright. I had passed the final liquidity test. I had watched my mother choose her life over her son's greed, and in doing so, I had finally closed the account on the Thorne legacy. There was no more family. There was only the firm. And for the first time in my life, the silence wasn't lonely. It was profitable.
The visiting room of the state penitentiary smelled of floor wax and stale coffee, a sharp, clinical scent that stripped away any illusion of power. I sat behind the reinforced glass, my hands resting on the cold metal counter. I wasn't wearing my designer blazer today. I wore a simple black sweater. I didn't need the armor of a CEO anymore. I was the only person in this room with a positive net worth. Julian was led in by a guard. He looked smaller, his skin sallow under the fluorescent lights, his hair buzzed short. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by a rough orange jumpsuit that finally matched the quality of his character. He picked up the phone, his eyes darting to mine with a mixture of hatred and a lingering, pathetic hope. "Did you come to gloat, Elena?" he rasped, his voice sounding thin through the receiver. "Did you come to see the golden boy in a cage? I hope it was worth the millions. I hope the board of Athelgard is proud of their cold-blooded leader." "I didn't come to gloat, Julian. I came to provide you with the final quarterly report," I said, my voice steady, devoid of the anger that used to fuel my late nights. The racketeering charges stuck. 5 to 7 years with no possibility of early parole given the nature of the pension fund embezzlement. You've been liquidated from the family ledger, officially. "You're a monster," he spat, leaning closer to the glass. "Mom and Dad, they'll never forgive you for this. You've destroyed their only son." "Mom and Dad are fine, Julian. They've moved into a permanent assisted living suite. It's quiet, it's safe, and most importantly, it's a place where your name is never mentioned. They've started a garden. Silas even joined a local chess club. They are finally living a life that isn't built on a house of cards. They don't miss the golden boy. They miss the peace they never had because of you." Julian laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "And the business, the Thorn legacy? I bet you sold it to the highest bidder, turned the warehouse into a parking lot for your tech bros." "Actually, no," I said, leaning back. "I kept the property, but Thorn Hardware and Supply no longer exists. I've converted the entire operation into the Thorn Vocational Foundation. We're using the old warehouse to train young people from broken homes in financial literacy and trade skills. We're teaching them how to build an inheritance that can't be gambled away in a weekend. It's the first time that name has ever stood for something sustainable." Julian's face twisted in a silent rage. He hated that I had transformed his failure into a public good. He hated that the nothing he left behind was now the seed for someone else's everything. "You think you won, Elena, but you're alone. You have your billions and your glass tower, and you have absolutely no one who loves you for who you are. You're just a balance sheet in a silk dress." "I'd rather be a balanced ledger than a bankrupt soul, Julian," I replied, standing up. "And as for being alone, I've spent 5 years building a world where no one can take anything from me. That isn't loneliness, that's sovereignty. I don't need to be loved by people who only see me as a source of liquidity. I'm finally at peace with my own value." I hung up the receiver before he could say another word. I watched the guard lead him away, a small orange speck retreating into the gray labyrinth of the prison. I walked out of the facility, the cold air of the evening hitting my face like a reset button. I drove back to the city, but I didn't go to my office. I drove to the old neighborhood, to the street where the amber-lit house used to stand. It was gone now. In its place was the construction site for the housing unit I'd promised, a modern, airy building designed to give shelter to those the world had tried to silence. I stood by the fence, watching the sunset reflect off the steel girders. I thought about the $84,000 I'd lost 5 years ago. It felt like a lifetime ago. It felt like a small, necessary price for the freedom I now possessed. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a notification from my head of acquisitions. IPO successfully launched. Valuation exceeded targets by 15%. Market sentiment bullish on Thorn. I smiled. The market wasn't just bullish on my company, it was bullish on the fact that I had survived the crash of my own family. I got back into my car and drove toward the skyline, the lights of the city rising up to meet me like a promise kept. I wasn't the daughter who sacrificed. I wasn't the sister who settled. I was the architect of my own destiny, and for the first time in 30 years, the internal audit was complete. The investment in nothing yielded the ultimate return. Me.